Hello? Fantastic. Ladies and gentlemen, thank you so much for coming. It's a pleasure to have you here to attend Tufts AI Society's first ever panel event, Ghosts in the Neural Net, Traversing the Ethics of Artificial Intelligence. It's a pleasure to have everybody here. We're so pleased. Before we start, I'd like to extend a thank you to my fellow club members, Iro Mavrou, Sam Bradley, Eli Newman, Alejandra Sabater, and Aiden McComiskey. Thank you guys for helping me make this possible. I really appreciate it. So now I'll introduce myself. My name's Jad Oubala. I'm a freshman at Tufts and the president and founder of the Tufts AI Society. So in other words, I'm completely unqualified to be moderating this debate, or panel discussion. Hopefully it's not a debate. But before we get to meet our fantastic panelists, who are going to save this from my moderating, I'd like to present a video that we've set up for you, so please enjoy. It should give some context and set the stage.
Trying to predict the future is a discouraging and hazardous occupation because the prophet invariably falls between two stools. If his predictions sound at all reasonable, you can be quite sure that in 20 or at most 50 years, the progress of science and technology has made him seem ridiculously conservative. On the other hand, if by some miracle a prophet could describe the future exactly as it was going to take place, his predictions would sound so absurd, so far-fetched, that everybody would laugh him to scorn. This has proved to be true in the past, and it will undoubtedly be true, even more so, of the century to come. So, if what I say now seems to you to be very reasonable, then I'll have failed completely. Only if what I tell you appears absolutely unbelievable have we any chance of visualizing the future as it really will happen. However, the most intelligent inhabitants of that future world won't be men or monkeys. They'll be machines, the remote descendants of today's computers. They will start to think, and eventually they will completely outthink their makers. I suspect that organic or biological evolution has about come to its end, and we are now at the beginning of inorganic or mechanical evolution, which will be thousands of times swifter.
In the landscape of technology, a story unfolded that would redefine the future, the story of artificial intelligence. It began with a dream, envisioned by Alan Turing's Turing test, positing a near future where machines could mirror human thought.
The interesting question is, just because something thinks differently from you, does that mean it's not thinking?
At the 1956 Dartmouth Conference, led by John McCarthy, this dream took its first breath as artificial intelligence.
And one of the things that happened at that conference was a comparison of the brain and computers.
This era birthed marvels like ELIZA, Joseph Weizenbaum's language processor, and Shaky the robot, a vanguard for integrated AI systems.
The hardware was really pretty primitive, but the software architecture and the software algorithms are what changed the world.
Frank Rosenblatt's perceptrons, capable of solving simple classification problems, opened doors to learning machines, seeding today's neural networks.
He's using it to explore the mysterious problem of how the brain learns.
The field was abuzz, setting the roots for the Goliath industry that AI makes up today. Marvin Minsky, John McCarthy, and others steered computer science from data crunching into realms of complex learning and reasoning. Today, artificial intelligence is revolutionizing every facet of our world. It has improved healthcare and medicine by aiding in early diagnosis and the development of pharmaceuticals. It has begun to transform environmental conservation with predictive models for climate change and natural disasters. In education, natural language processing is tailoring learning experiences to individual needs, enhancing accessibility and engagement. As we look to the future, it becomes clear that the potential of AI to improve our world is immeasurable, but like all advancements, it's far from perfect. AI algorithms can lead to cybersecurity breaches, dangerous weapons manufacturing, and privacy loss through widespread surveillance. And with the spread of AI-generated misinformation, the line between that which is and isn't real becomes blurred, a terrifying prospect for a society built on trust in its institutions.
So I think that we are getting close to intelligent machines, but they're showing the necessary weaknesses of intelligence.
As the field of artificial intelligence continued to proliferate, so too did it begin to enter the minds of the public. It saturated film and television, drawing wide conclusions and inspiring awe and fear in equal measure.
One day the AIs are going to look back on us the same way we look at fossil skeletons in the plains of Africa.
Film and TV reflect not only our fascination with the potential of AI, but also our apprehension about its boundaries. Its narratives not only entertain, but also provoke critical thought surrounding the ethical implications of artificial intelligence. While to many, the dystopian apocalypse of AGI seems a far-fetched exaggeration, fears of AI as an existential and epistemic threat continue to grow. But debates on the legitimacy of these threats have polarized scholars, leaving much uncertainty as to what the path forward should be in terms of regulating AI.
Biden administration's newest effort to control the growth of artificial intelligence.
New presidential order on artificial intelligence.
The White House rolling out a sweeping executive order today aiming to monitor and regulate the risks of artificial intelligence.
My worst fears are that we, the field, the technology, the industry, cause significant harm to the world.
I think the development of full artificial intelligence could spell the end of the human race.
The type of system that we're talking about that might approach human-level intelligence have not been designed. They don't exist. And so discussing their danger and their potential harm is a bit like, discussing the sex of angels.
We should be talking about things like legislation, things like the risks of bias, the ways in which AI is being used maybe in ways that isn't very good for society at large, but instead we're focusing on these hypothetical risks.
And I started reading more of the research that's been done to study whether we can build machines that we will not lose control of. And the horrible realization is we don't know how to do that yet.
Does humanity know what it's doing?
No.
You believe they can understand?
Yes.
You believe they are intelligent?
Yes.
Will they have self-awareness, consciousness?
Oh, yes. I think they will in time.
First of all, I'm thrilled to introduce Professor Tina Eliassi-Rad, laureate of the Lagrange Prize and a trailblazer in the world of data science and network science. Her research spans a wide range of topics, including machine learning, computational social science, and fairness in artificial intelligence. As the Joseph E. Aoun Professor at Northeastern University, she's been at the forefront of advocating for ethical considerations in artificial intelligence and machine learning. Her work is not just academically rigorous, but also crucial for the development of responsible AI technologies. Her perspective on the ethical implications of AI are both thought-provoking and essential for our discussion today, so please welcome her to the stage. Now on to the Tufts professors. Next, we are honored to have with us Professor Matthias Scheutz, a distinguished researcher in the field of artificial intelligence and robotics. He's one of our own here at Tufts and the director of the Human Robotics Interaction Laboratory. Professor Scheutz's work has made significant contributions to our understanding of human-robot interaction, natural language, and ethical decision-making in autonomous systems. His work in developing robots capable of complex interactions and ethical reasoning is not only pioneering, but also critical in shaping the future of AI. Please welcome to the stage. Finally, Daniel Dennett has already joined us here. Professor Dennett is a celebrated author and thinker, a personal hero of mine, and arguably one of the most, if not the most, influential philosopher and cognitive scientists of our era. His work in creating some of the most groundbreaking novels like Consciousness Explained and Darwin's Dangerous Idea, both of which I'm shamelessly going to ask him to sign after this event, have been incredible and pivotal in bridging the gap between philosophy and cognitive science. His insights into the nature of consciousness and philosophy of AI are not just intellectually profound, but also deeply relevant in today's rapidly evolving technological landscape. Please welcome him. Hello? Testing? Perfect. So, first of all, I want to say thank you guys so much for joining us here today. It's a huge honor, especially as a brand new club that just formed, and for our first panel as well. Just one more round of applause for our amazing panelists. So, I know our video mentioned a lot of different topics. Some of them, inspiring, some of them great, others very terrifying, very scary. And we hear a lot about this term AGI, artificial general intelligence. So it's often used interchangeably with things like strong AI or even singularity. But what really is it? What does it mean for society? And how far are we from reaching it? Professor Scheutz, maybe you can give us some insight on that as someone who's done research on the roadmap to AGI.
Yeah, so I would keep those terms separate. Strong AI doesn't necessarily mean AGI, right? And currently, I was at a workshop 12 years ago, 15 years ago, and people talked about a roadmap for artificial general intelligence. And some people argued at that time, it's just a few years out. And, here we are. And we still don't have it, right? So there's a little bit of a danger in projecting something into systems that is actually not in the system. And admittedly, it's getting more and more difficult to not think that the system has certain capabilities, as I'm sure we'll talk about.
Fantastic. Professor Dennett, I wanted to point out to the audience and all of us here that Ghost of the Neural Net, well, it's definitely a catchy name. It's actually a reference to the late Gilbert Ryle, who, as I understand, was your mentor, and he used it in a different context. He used Ghost in the Machine, which was a sort of criticism of the Cartesian dualism, which in sort of layman's terms is this idea that consciousness is not the result of physical processes. And Gilbert Ryle was not a fan of this idea. He felt he was a computationalist, felt that it could be described by physical properties. So maybe you could shed some insight for us and tell us a little bit about what consciousness is and could artificial intelligence systems have them? And I think you're the only person I could get away with asking what is consciousness to, so have fun with that.
I'm going to be obstreperous and not answer your question. I think it's very important that we not spend any time arguing about what consciousness is, and I'm going to say why as soon as I show you a couple of slides.
Why don't we segue right into that then? I'll put those up for you. We can hardly blame an ex-Tufts professor for coming back to Tufts and lecturing us again, so please.
Or can you hear me? You can hear me okay? Well, is this better or worse? Okay. All right. How many of you have ever read The Library of Babel? Almost nobody. Oh, well, I am happy to introduce you to one of the great science fiction philosophy stories of all times by Borges, The Library of Babel. It's a story about obviously not, as you get into it, not a real library, where all the possible books are. That is, here's a version. If each book has 500 pages and there are 2,000 characters per page from a set of 100 different symbols, then we have 100 to the 1,250,000 power. That's how many possible different books there are in the Library of Babel. Now you can't put that. That's not infinite. It's a finite number, but it's unbelievably, obscenely large. That's the possible books. And I just want to draw your attention to how big this number is and what an impossible space this is. So I have a little crutch to help you see it. So the Library of Babel, first of all, I have two terms which are better than saying infinite and infinitesimal. The number of possible books isn't infinite if we have those limits. It's an obscenely large number, but it's not infinite. And infinitesimal, a single book in the library is not an infinitesimal, but it's vanishing. So I have vast and vanishing. These two terms, vast means practically infinite, and vanishing means infinitesimal. A needle in a haystack beyond description. So here's the Library of Babel. This is how big it is. Oh, no, that was not what was supposed to happen. What did I hit? Okay, here we are. A vast but vanishing subset of the books in the Library of Babel are composed of English words. The rest are just letters, randomly chosen from the symbols. A vast but vanishing subset of those are composed of grammatical sentences. A vast but vanishing subset of those make sense. Most of the books, all but a vanishingly small subset, would be what you get if you went to the Tisch library and took 1,000 books at random and copied a sentence from each one chosen at random, and you would have a completely nonsensical text, but they'd all be grammatical sentences. A vast but vanishing subset of those books are about somebody named John. A vast but vanishing subset of those are about the death of John F. Kennedy. A vast, when I say vast, I mean still, much more than you could put in the Library of Congress or even on the planet Earth, of the books about JFK's death in the Library of Babel are true. And a vast but vanishing subset of them are composed entirely of limericks. So this is an unbelievably huge space. And if we ask which books actually exist, this is a all but invisible thread, vanishing thread of books that are in an important sense descendants of the books that are already in there. Shakespeare had to read a lot of books before he could write his plays. I had to read a lot of books before I could teach my classes at Tufts or write any books. So there's relations of descent of sorts, they're loose, between all those texts. Vanishing branches in the million-dimensional space. All the readable texts are descendants of other texts, until now composed by human language users, but not anymore. We now have texts created by large language models, for instance, which are not created by human language users. They're created by a new kind of exploratory software vehicle that can move through the Library of Babel. And it isn't all gibberish. In fact, it's far from gibberish. It's seductively, apparently meaningful. This is what I want to talk about. It's a very important concern. LLMs can produce texts that are descendants of the same lineages as you and I can, but by a different method. We need to be informed about which kind of text generator we're using or was used to create any text. Not because people are always better or more reliable generators of truth. No, I'm not making that point. Not because only conscious, sentient beings can mean anything. No, I'm not making that point either. We must avoid what we might call anthroponormativity. Maybe LLMs can do wonderful things that we can't come close to doing. I'm not ruling that out at all. I just want us to be able to tell the difference. And that's because LLMs are not people, they're counterfeit people. Some of you may have seen an article I did in Atlantic called The Problem of Counterfeit People. Counterfeit money has been a social, political, economic problem ever since money was first made. And the penalties for counterfeiting have always been severe. I want to suggest counterfeit people are more dangerous, more destructive, potentially destructive of human civilization than counterfeit money ever was, and that's what I want to talk about. They're more like novelists than historians or reporters. They strive for truthiness, not truth. They have no conscience. They have no commitment to honesty. They have no shame. Bertrand Russell once said this creative process has all the advantages of theft over honest toil. And here's perhaps the most important point. Real people have skin in the game and can be held responsible. An LLM is as good as the immortal, has no fears, can't be hurt, and has no skin in the game. So I want to really quickly run through a simple argument. And I'm deliberately glossing over the technical points. Many of you may want to jump in and add a point. I have a few points of my own to go. First of all, any software can be replicated with ultra-high fidelity. That is the hallmark of computers. If there are also mutations, either intentional or accidental, then evolution by natural selection will occur. Something doesn't have to be alive to evolve. Viruses aren't alive, they evolve, as you know very well. The mutations that are fitter, that is, better at getting themselves replicated, will increase in frequency in the population. They will not be alive, or conscious, or sentient. Forget about those wrinkles, since they are dangerous distractions. It really frustrates and annoys me that, for instance, the philosopher David Chalmers makes a big question about whether LLMs are conscious or will they ever be conscious. Forget it. They're not conscious now, but they're already very, very, very dangerous. So just leave aside the question of whether they're ever going to be conscious or sentient. It's just not. We have bigger problems to worry about that are on our doorstep right now. Right now, the replication of large language models is more or less under human control, but not perfectly. One of Darwin's great points is that the key to domestication is the control of reproduction. When an animal that has been domesticated gets out of control of reproduction, then it goes feral. So control of reproduction is the key to domestication. Mutations that escape human control will be feral and will be relatively impervious to human efforts to extinguish them. So we should expect a population explosion of dangerous, manipulative, attention-grabbing memes, mind viruses, to engulf us. This will endanger human trust and the human ability to tell truth from falsehood, and will thereby threaten informed government and self-control. Civilization is more fragile than people realize. One of my technical terms that I introduce gets a lot of play in various fields is the intentional stance. It's the habit we all have. It's like an instinct. When something complicated moves around, and especially if it seems to be talking, we adopt the intentional stance. It's irresistible, and we treat it as a thinking, meaning human agent with an agenda and with beliefs and desires, and we cannot resist adopting this in digital worlds. It's just impossible. If you've played with a chat bot, you know that you adopt the intentional stance. Otherwise, it's hopeless. You can't get any leverage at all. Evolution by natural selection has not prepared us with adaptations to survive in the digital worlds we are now creating. Those who do not abandon the internet entirely will be moving through minefields of attention attractors, only some of which will be clickbait devices deliberately designed by people. So they will need protection, just the way our ancestors needed protection when they ventured into hostile environments in polar regions, underwater, in the air. Those who abandon the internet will be left unable to learn what is happening in the world, including any safety measures anybody develops. So unless we take very strong steps immediately to prevent the spread of these new viruses, we will soon enter a new dark age. It may be too late to stop this from happening. Jeff Hinton thinks it's probably too late. Yoshua Bengio thinks it may be too late. They know they are two of the godfathers of LLMs. They know what these systems are. If we mobilize the most capable creators of immunizing systems and other safeguards, we may be able to control the situation, roughly the way we are now overcoming pandemics like COVID. Treat this from a biological perspective, because we're facing a kind of runaway natural selection, which will not, we don't even have to propose bad actors. It can be just accidental. That's how mutation happens, is oops, and then it's out. It's time to get working on all of this. A few clarifications. Big systems like GPT-3 or GPT-4, they could be replicated, but they're gigantic. Of course, they are replicated. They know enough to keep a replica in the bank, but they're not going to proliferate. They're gigantic. Consider them instead as the generators of diversity that evolution depends on. It's their products that will be replicated and mutated. I just picked this up off of a website a couple of days ago. OpenAI have reduced the point of entry to developing an AI bot to more or less zero, making it possible for anyone who has basic prompting skills, not even coding skills, to build their own AI. The process is pretty simple. If it helps the AI to complete your task, you can also switch in on plugins like blah, 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 blah. In other words, do-it-yourself fake people, counterfeit people, are now not just available, but not even that expensive. Now with software, we don't have to worry too much about so-called SNPs or single nucleotide polymorphisms, but the typos of software, we have to worry more about other kinds of mistaken copying. It's the human thinkos that are going to be replicated, not the human typos or the coding errors, which good compiler can strip out most coding errors. For instance, legacy code that has been commented out but is still in the program may be commented back in, and then who knows what it's going to do. I almost finished, one more point. I run into people who say, well, of course we can control this. We can make the LLMs, we can solve the alignment problem. What version of Word are you using now? How many mutations of Word have there been? How many corrections? How many updates? Writing large systems that are bugless, that are problem-free, nobody's done it yet. Nobody's done it yet. So don't think that we are in control. What do you think red teaming is for? It's for trying to prevent the mistakes that are in there, the oversights, the blind spots from propagating. And the very existence of red teaming shows that we don't have the sort of epistemological control over these systems that a lot of people just assume we do. Okay. No, I'm going to stop right there, and because I think.
Well, boy, I'm sure glad you didn't answer my question. That was a fantastic lecture there. So I'm curious because this reminds me about, I think your colleague Susan Blackmore, right? She coined the term tremes, which is, there's memes and genes, and then there's tremes, these sort of like technological replicators, which is interesting too because, and on the video, Arthur C. Clarke very interestingly predicted this. He talked about, a new type of evolution. He called it mechanical evolution, this idea that these machines, artificial intelligence, for example, will self-replicate much, much faster than, like you said, nucleotides or genes. So I'm curious what your insight on that is. Like, actually, Professor Eliassi-Rad, you're someone who's done research on these sorts of questions, right? The practical approach of how we resolve this. It's a terrifying prospect. What do you think we can do? What do we need to start doing? I know there's a recent research paper with some thinkers, like you mentioned, Yoshua Bengio, Geoffrey Hinton. They talked about really calling to action, setting regulations, making these corporations pay significant amounts of their money invested into ethical research and regulating their AI. And I think it's pretty terrifying that the same people that create these models are oftentimes the ones testing them.
So we should take a step back. When the internet became a thing, the United States government decided not to regulate it. So it was the wild, wild west. And that led us to the big tech companies now. We had a lot of innovation, we had no regulation. When Sam Altman, and you showed it in your video, goes in front of Congress and says we need regulations, why is he doing that? He doesn't want to be regulated. It is not that he's scared. He wants to block open source software. Because open source now, for about $200,000, you can get hardware and do what the kid at Clearview AI did. Scrape images from the internet, have a company, make a lot of money, sell your product to police departments, etc., high schools, banks, Macy's, so on and so forth. So all this stuff that you're hearing about AI governance, regulations, none of this has teeth, at least not in America. Professor Dennett mentioned something about accountability. I can do anything, nothing will happen to me. That's where we are now, right? My community, the AI community, the computer science community, we're slowly getting into these codes of ethics. We did a study on the societal impact statements of papers that were submitted to NeurIPS. This is Neural Information Processing System, one of the top conferences in AI machine learning 2 years ago. And basically, the way AI researchers are looking at this breaks down into 3 themes. One is lack of agency. Look, it's not me, I'm just doing the math. And I am not kidding you, I'm just paraphrasing, but there were statements written in the paper saying to the effect, yes, my model can be used to harm underrepresented people and minorities, but look how cool the math is. Yes, to train my model, we may harm the climate because these models have lots and lots of parameters, right? You cannot replicate them easily. You need a lot of money to do a big, large language model. They're like, but don't worry about the harm to the climate. Look how cool the math is, right? The number one citizen is the math. Everything else, who cares, right? The second theme was denying responsibility. Look, this is by and large good for society. Yeah, there could be some harms, but a lot of AI researchers are utilitarian. Basically, I'm maximizing some notion of expected utility in this objective function, right? Or like, look, don't worry about it, kind of thing. And then the last one was reassigning responsibility. That, look, somebody in the future should solve this problem, but it wouldn't be me. Like, why would I think of it? Because math is number one. So there's a lot of things you're hearing about regulations, about AI governance. None of them have teeth in America. In Europe, some of them have teeth. However, for example, the EU AI Act, it's breaking it down based on risks, right? But first of all, even within the same risk level, your risk and my risk are very different because these AI tools operate differently on different people. They're like drugs. And second of all, if a member country of EU decides that it's a national security at stake, all of that goes out the window. So if Macron in France decides this is national security, your AI Act, your regulations are out the door. In America, they're going with your civil rights. I'm trampling on your civil rights, but there's no bill. Nothing will happen to you. If I create deep fakes of you in terms of pornography or whatever and send it, nothing happens so far, right? You hear all this stuff. In fact, I'm writing as part of a big group about UNESCO AI and gender inequality, and one of the professors who was online was saying that this was happening to a student of hers, and nothing's happening, and they're in UK, right? So you hear a lot of stuff, it's just chatter, it's just to distract you, because nothing really substantive is happening. And then just one thing, and then I'll relinquish this, because this is my main message for you guys. Whenever you hear about risks and harms of AI and another AI technology is going to solve it, that is wrong. These AI technologies are being used as part of society. It's a complex system. You have to take a complex systems view of it. There's feedback. Think about recommendations you get from Amazon. Those recommendations affect our economic processes, it affects our economic regulation, it affects the algorithms. The same way with our politics, the recommendations you get affect our political processes, that affect our political regulation, and round and round we go. If you're using a dating app, it's the same thing. The dating app recommends who you should date, that affects our social processes, that affects the acceptability in our society of who you can date, and round we go. And feedback is just one feature of a complex system. And if you really want to solve this problem, then you need to take the bigger holistic view of it. If you're not, then it's all just whatever, chatter, you know. Go read or do some other fun things.
Can I add something? So in general, I think I agree with a lot of your points, right? To say that the legislation has no teeth, I would disagree a little bit with, especially in the EU. They had a high-level expert group that they started 5-6 years ago, right? They really actually thought about, different from the US, about a very important aspect, and that's really the point I want to make here. AI technology is very different from other technologies, even though as a technology, the same ethical questions apply as with other technologies, right? You can take nuclear, you can take bio, you can take nano, right? They all have questions. Who should use the technology? Where should you use it? When should you use it, right? All of that. AI is just like that. The difference with AI is that we are building autonomous systems that can perceive and can act in the world, independent of humans, right? That you don't get with these other technologies. And as a result, the ethical questions pertaining to AI are not just about AI, but about how ethics gets into the AI system itself, right? You don't only need to think about how we use it, but you need to think about how the system makes decisions and whether those decisions are consistent with our moral expectations and societal norms. The EU thought about that. As far as I can tell, if you look at the various different position papers we have in the US, DOD papers and so forth, that is never a key core component about the ethics in the system, right? The other point I want to make is what makes AI technology very different, and you mentioned that. You can go and download the code. It's all available on the internet, and you can buy a computer and run it. You cannot do that with a nuclear power plant. You cannot just build it. So there is no technological threshold for getting AI systems up and running anymore, right? But that's a key point. So now I'm coming to why I think legislation is critical. What are you going to do about it, right? If anybody can go and get it and train a system on their data, so we can artificially introduce a technological hurdle, right? And actually, we had a paper where we introduced one way of doing it, but that would require, the chip technologies and so forth to change. The other one is legislation. And there are good arguments to make about, well, what if, for example, the adversaries don't do the same thing that we do, right? And so we can open that up as well.
Yeah, but the regulations, the thing is that if the regulations are such that you're just gonna even restrict the power only in the hand of a few, as it is now, so the whole thing behind the Stanford Center for Foundational Models, really bad name, was that Stanford was crying that they don't have the resources that Google has. Right? It's like, okay, my heart does not bleed for Stanford. Now, in fact, they're gonna have a national AI resource center. Your tax dollars will most likely go to folks in these richer universities to be able to do that. The part is, who's gonna have that power, right? And this is why I said in terms of teeth, even you're absolutely right, in the EU, they're better. However, if a member country decides it's national security, it's over. They can do whatever they want. They can trample on that AI Act, right? So what are the safeguards about national security? Who decides, right? So there's some of that. And then I just want to say one thing that Professor Dennett mentioned. When you hear, because there's so much hype, right? It's as if it's magic, right? There is no magic. For example, right now, you may have heard about this news in Time magazine. There's a lot of neo-colonialism going on. What do I mean by that? These big tech companies hire these guys called agents in Kenya and Venezuela, et cetera. They pay them minimal amount of dollars. They give them a quota of how many, for example, bad content like child pornography you have to label for us. These guys, can you imagine? You would get post-traumatic stress syndrome. When they do get that and they go to these big tech companies for help, they fire them. So there's a lot of human labeling going on behind all of this, content moderation, that you never hear about. Why? Because they don't want your Western ears and eyes to think about that. Neocolonialism sounds bad, right? Because colonialism was bad. But we don't hear about that, because they don't want us to hear about it.
Let me comment on Europe compared to the United States in one regard. The Euro constellation is basically a watermarking system that makes it very hard to make counterfeit money in Europe, because the money there is multicolored and has all sorts of other sort of high-tech ways that make it very difficult to copy. How many of you study carefully every $20 bill you ever get? Do any of you bother? No. You don't bother because you don't have to. Because we actually have, laws against counterfeiting, and with severe penalties. It used to be a capital offense death, execution. But you can get 25 years for counterfeiting in the United States now, for counterfeiting money. So counterfeiting people, as I suggested, is worse, more dangerous than counterfeiting money. Now, the reason that the Euro constellation is this watermark on currency in Europe and around the world, really. And if you buy a high-end color copier, it won't copy. It shuts down if you try to copy money in your copy machine. Did you know that? It's a nice, cool trick. We can do that. We can. It'll be an arms race because there will always be people going around the edges. But we could have a law, for instance, that said every manufacturer of hardware that's internet accessible, every laptop, every phone, every tablet, everything that you can use to get on the internet, has got to have software in it for labeling counterfeit people, not letting counterfeit texts, counterfeit people be routinely accepted as real people. That would be a start. And I think it's one of my goals is to, when I talk to people in AI, especially young people in AI these days, I find that a lot of them, they think it's just cool to add human touches, to make Siri more like a human being, to put the Disney touches in, the ums and ahs and so forth. I think one of the things we might be able to do is simply reverse that and say, no, that's not cool at all. The cool thing, let it be fluent in 17 languages. Let it answer questions, but make sure the voice establishes that it is not a human being. And it can even sound much more like a human being than that. But if we had the software, if we had the watermarking, we could simply turn that around so that instead of being proud of fooling people, they'd be ashamed. Let's try to get people in the field to recognize that it's not cool to fool people with an LLM. It's not. It's not fun, it's not cool. You may get rich, counterfeiters may get rich, but you are in fact attacking one of the fundamental, principle is the wrong word, one of the fundamental bases of society, of civilization, is trust. Talking to people, listening, persuading, making promises, shaking hands. We tamper with that at our great peril.
Yeah, and as we have seen in our democracy, right? So our democracy is a complex system. These tools that spread misinformation and disinformation reinforce the instability in our society. And the way to try to shore up stability in our democracy, 2/3 of the democracies on the planet are going to vote in 2024, 2/3 of them. How do you feel about it? I feel like we're on the Titanic, right? So, but the way to shore it up would be with, for example, citizen assemblies, where you actually meet people, right? And you discuss topics, right? You mandate transparency, you ensure connectivity. Otherwise, yeah, we will have this kind of, we don't know what is true and what is not, right? This notion of, what I'm seeing, is this a deep fake or is it not, right? In fact, one of the things that's happened in the in the recent Middle East conflict, there hasn't been that many credible deep fakes. There have been deep fakes, but they've been very bad. But because people know that there are deep fakes out there, they don't believe the images they see. You have these other things that happen because you know something exists.
Eric Horvitz is the chief scientist at Microsoft. You can find a talk of his online where he uses the phrase, the post-epistemic world. Now that is one terrifying phrase. What it means is the world where nobody knows what anybody knows, where mutual knowledge, which is the very bedrock of human civilization, where mutual knowledge is can no longer be taken for granted. And if we move into an era where the tools for destroying the credibility of truth tellers and enhancing the credibility of liars goes up, we're in a very dangerous situation.
So Dan, in my lab, for sure, we've always argued that you don't want to build robots that look like people, that give off the wrong signals, because there's lots of research that shows the more human-like something looks, the easier it is and more natural for people to infer human-like qualities, right? And so we can take that away, right? But language, as you know, is very powerful. And the phenomenon that we see now with certain dating apps where people actually know, right? You don't disguise it. It's not it's a counterfeit person, right? But it's not disguised. It's not disguised behind a human-like appearance. It's just text, right? Or maybe it is an animated agent. And this animated agent talks, right? And it provides the feedback and the comfort and whatever else you need, right? And still people know it's fake, right? They know that that's not a real person, yet they will talk about dating the person, loving the person, they want to marry that person.
It's like
right?
the movie Her.
It's like Her. It's exactly like Her, except Her was a movie 6, 7 years ago, or maybe more, right? And that's working right now. We have lots of these dating situations. Yeah. So it's not clear to me that to say it's not cool is gonna, or to say, let's take the human appearance away, right, is going to fix that.
Oh, well, human appearance is just part of it. I mean, language, I think you're right, is a more telling, it has been for millennia the most foolproof way of telling whether you've got a person in front of you or something else. But that's now fading into the background.
Yeah, I think in part all of these tools feed our laziness, right? It's a lot easier to chat with a chatbot than a human being. I mean, I'm a computer scientist, I'm an introvert, I'd rather chat and talk to a chat box. I mean, I'm just being honest. I love the pandemic.
Is that true?
I was very productive, or like, for example, with the large language models, right? Oh, they will write the first draft of your paper for you. Great. You don't have to think about it. But to me, like, the part of thinking about it and being creative, that's the real fun part of it, right? And so you're basically giving it to this machine and you're being lazy. So it's just about, like, how lazy do you want to be, and how far you can get.
People are complicated, right? And that app may not be complicated.
Well, the app wants to please you, right? The thing with the large language models is that the next word is not only probable, but it's likable to you, right? And so, look, it's just easier, But I guess the one thing I want to, like, in terms of, like, what you guys can do, right? One is, like, critical thinking is obviously extremely important. Think about the incentives of the people in power who are generating these kinds of tools. When AI tools are being used in healthcare, is it to provide you, the patient, with better care? Or is it that the doctor will see you only for 10 minutes as opposed to 15 minutes, and so the doctor, the healthcare company, et cetera, all make money, right? Try to get past the hype, right? There was this thing about how, now we don't need radiologists, like an AI tool can tell whether you have skin cancer or not. Well, they found out that what that particular deep network had learned was that images that have a ruler are correlated with the mole in the same image having cancer. It didn't learn that the mole was cancerous, right? It's just all associations. And yes, it's great. we have enough data, we have big machines, we can learn these weighted associations, look what we can do with it. But it's not that it's really understanding what is going on. It cannot explain things to you the way that we think about it.
I think one of the reasons, if you watch the congressional hearing, it was amazing to hear senators and congressmen saying, this is the first time an industry has ever come to us begging for regulation. This is weird. What's going on? Well, I think there's many things going on. One is they want to protect themselves against massive lawsuits that would make the Dominion voting machines look like chump change. Now, here's one of the possible legal ways of making a dent in this. Let's look at medicine. There are now very, very powerful medical systems. Doctors take a Hippocratic oath because they really honestly want to honor that oath, not to do harm. They're going to find themselves more and more trusting the system because they've got track records saying it's more trustworthy than their, cowboy judgment, their seat of the pants intuitive judgment, and they will not be willing to overrule the machine. Now, think of how that one is going to change the job, the profession, the calling of being a doctor. Doctors are going to be more and more like uniformed doormen at expensive high-rise apartment buildings. Great bedside manner and good typing skills, and otherwise they're going to be delegating responsibility to the machines because they believe on good evidence that the machines are better than they are. Now, what do we do about that? I don't know what we're going to do about making the life of a doctor seem like an exciting and good profession, but we can treat this as special liability. And in special liability laws, ignorance is no excuse. Anybody who trusts a software system that makes a mistake, you're liable. If you're the doctor. So the doctor's going to have humongous malpractice insurance. And the companies that make the systems are going to have unbelievable underwriting insurance because of the risks they run. And the insurance companies it will be in their interest to make these systems as foolproof as possible, as transparent as possible. One idea is that you can't use this system until you can prove to the system that you know what its limits are. When you can tell the difference between its reliable responses and its truthy responses, then maybe we'll license you to use this software, and then you can get the insurance you need to use the hardware. But until we do something like that, we're just in the Wild West.
Yeah, I think that's an excellent point. So there was a case in Wisconsin where a judge overthrew a plea deal that the lawyers had made because an automated risk assessment tool had said that the risk of this guy committing a crime was very large. And to me, it's just unbelievable that the judge is treating this software, this machine learning AI software, as an expert witness without cross-examining it. Can you believe it? And this software was just producing a risk assessment score. The risk of this guy committing a crime is 8. No uncertainty values. No, I'm about 30% sure, and this is what I mean by saying 30% sure. It just boggles the mind. And in particular, because a lot of these systems also do not do well on all of us, right? For example, the facial recognition systems will do better on Professor Dennett than on me, right? They usually don't do well on women, and they don't do well on darker skinned women, right? Or the oximeters that we were all using during the pandemic, we have known for decades that those oximeters that measure the amount of blood, oxygen in your blood do not work very well for darker skinned people. All that data is going into the systems that are developing this AI, ML tools in healthcare. Well, guess what? It's not going to do as well on you if you have a darker skin. What are you going to do, right? If the insurance company is saying to the doctor, you have to use this. So this notion of these algorithms should be treated like drugs is actually something that has been written that we should think about. And maybe they should have these warning labels that everybody understands. Like the same way when you go to Walgreens or whatever and you get drugs on the label, like you never read the big thing, right? Nobody reads that, you just chuck it, right? The big disclaimer or whatever. But you look at the thing and say, oh, okay, I shouldn't have vodka when I take this, right? Something like that. So we should have some of those.
It's a terrifying prospect that precisely the thing that is going to create this existential epistemic threat in our world is the thing that we tend to, we're like now tending towards trusting more than people with experience. I mean, it's a pretty terrifying prospect. I'm curious now, because this begs the question, right? I mean, inevitably, it's hard to stop progress, but it's very important that we adapt to it properly and create these regulations and take these measures. Professor Scheutz, in developing these sorts of programs, these artificial intelligence models, how do we make them? So I know your focus is largely on making them ethical. As they become more autonomous, as they become more apparent. How do we do that? And how do we do that in a world where ethical and social norms are not always standard and not always agreed upon?
Yeah, okay, so let me actually, before I answer that, say something about AI and what AI is, right? Because we've been talking here implicitly about a particular kind of AI, data-driven and realized in deep neural nets, right? Different forms of deep neural nets. That is not all of AI, right? To your point, the question you asked me initially about strong AI, that's a particular kind of AI that is based on symbolic representation, symbols, defined semantics, logical inference, reasoning, right? Introspectability, all the parts that actually are still being used, right? You would not go to a deep neural network and make it find you a route on Google Maps. You do that with a planning algorithm, and we know that they do it optimally and faster than anything else, right? There's lots of these algorithms out there, and they are also AI. That's one point. The second point is that currently, a lot of people in the community already know where the limits are with these deep neural nets, right? And I think one thing maybe for people who have heard about it and don't know how they work, what you have to understand is what the basic operational principle is behind it, right? And that's what makes a lot of these things so scary. The basic principle is that you take a sequence of words or tokens, right? And the network figures out what the probabilities of the next word. And then you take that word and you add it to that input. And then it produces, based on this longer sequence, right, it comes up with the most likely one. But by most likely, it flips a coin, right? It has a distribution of different possible follow-on words, and it picks one. So every single time you operate ChatGPT or any of these programs, they create sentences. They don't look anything up. There's no database. There's no, I figured it out, I planned. There's none of that. It's a repeated coin flipping based on this input. And just to give you a sense for how large that input can be, the latest models can take simultaneously in a 300-page book, right? By the time I say book, which is one word, you heard that, it would have read 300 pages, okay? That's what it bases its judgment on. Okay, and you know, there are efforts now to think about how these models can be combined with symbolic AI because people know what the shortcomings are. So now to your question, how do we do that? What we do is actually we use a combination of logic-based and classical AI methods and machine learning methods to explicitly represent ethical principles in the system and reason with them and find, based on these principles, the best possible actions And in some cases, the best possible actions may not be straightforward. There may be trade-offs between normative principles, as we know. And what people are good at is deciding which principle to drop when they're in conflict. So we have an algorithm that does that also, okay? So it's a hybrid system. It uses machine learning to find the best strategy given those explicit normative principles. And now to your question of how do we decide? We don't decide, right? That's not up to us. We have to produce the computational framework that makes it possible for an artificial system or a robot to reason ethically and to make decisions based on these principles. What principles go in? Well, you can take your favorite ethical theory, you can take cultural norms, you can take laws, legal principles, etiquette, right? There's a lot of things that could go in.
So if I may follow up on that. So for Google Maps, you're absolutely right. They do planning for the route, but to estimate how long it's going to take, they're actually using deep networks. So Peter Velichkovich at DeepMind, there's this whole ML for optimization. Sure. So for the actual time estimate. But the one thing, since you brought up risks and of existential risk, I'm actually more worried about climate change. So these companies do not mention how much carbon footprint these large language models are taking. So I'm going to read this because it was from a recent article. So it is believed that training ChatGPT's GPT-3 model produced 500 metric tons of CO2, which is equivalent to over 1 million miles driven by average gasoline-powered cars. This was reported in The Guardian over the summer, right? And if each one of us is going to have one of these large language models, I'm going to let you in on a secret. I have a graduate student who's now interning at Google. And Google, if you're a Google user, they're building a large language model for you. Each one of you is going to have a large language model. And then if I'm interacting with you, now I have a social network of this large language model. So just think about the climate aspects of this.
So inevitably that leads us to ask, is how do we approach this problem? Like, does this cause for, I know some thinkers say we should stop the development of AI, we should adopt this, but others say that that's inevitably beneficial to corporations and things like that.
No, I think we should educate ourselves. We should vote for the people who will actually represent us in this. Like, for example, in many of these kinds of meetings that the Biden administration has had, they didn't have anybody from the community there. I guess why? Like, there was all these big tech guys there, but nobody from the communities that are affected by these technology. Nobody from all of us was there. Right? And so I think it's just basically educating ourselves and voting for the right people to try to change it bottom up, as opposed to top down. I mean, you could go top down too, but.
And just to make that problem seem a little grimmer, I know a number of people in AI who have been trying to talk to the staffs of Congress people. And they prep for a meeting. They pour their heart and soul in being ready to answer all their questions clearly. And they go, and the staff people are clueless, or pretty close to clueless. So the problem is that the supposedly trained people, the experts who will guide the legislators into good legislation, are not well equipped to do this. And Google and Microsoft, OpenAI, they like to talk about how many hundreds or thousands of people they have working on safety and alignment and all that. Well, if the number were an order of magnitude higher, that wouldn't be enough either. If you're into this technology, the idea of becoming an expert advisor and constructor of regulations and rules and thinking very carefully and scientifically about how to do this, I think that would be a great way. If there are jobs, wonderful jobs in that area for you folks, when you graduate, then we're all in the soup.
I'm curious, one more question. I'm curious about the question of transparency, right? Because you talked about, regulation. It's very beneficial for these big tech companies because it localizes who has control over, these AI models, these LLMs or whatever it may be. But what about, there's the counter argument potentially about, this is like extremely dangerous piece of technology that if it's in the bad hands of one bad agent, it can be completely out of control. So how do we approach that question of transparency, being clear about AI and who has access to it and things like that, while also making sure that these big tech companies can't take advantage of people?
I think we need to separate out what AIs we're talking about, right? So you don't want to stifle innovation. But for example, I always get this question well, if we don't do it, the Chinese will do it. Well, we have certain values. We need to stick to our values, right? Now, in terms of transparency, you can try to, for example, query a large language model to try to figure out what it was trained on. So there was a paper a couple of years ago that actually one of my colleagues, Elena Opria, along with Google folks, Apple folks, OpenAI, were okay, what was this large language model trained on? The question is, how do you define transparency? The same way, for example, in your slides, what does replicability mean exactly? In fact, in machine learning, in artificial intelligence, it's very difficult to exactly replicate the other person's results. But so we need to discuss what is replicability. And in fact, so my husband here, Brendan Feidelson, who's a professor of philosophy at Northeastern, he ran a summer school in Italy about the replicability crisis in science. We hear it all the time. There's a huge one in machine learning. So in terms of transparency, I would like to have a definition of it. So I'm not giving you a good answer because that's one of the things that we all need to think about. What is transparency to you for a large language model? Because it has hundreds of billions of parameters. What are you going to do with it? You know what I mean? So there's ad hoc post-explanation of things, but that's not very good.
That we come up with that definition, we don't leave it amorphous?
Oh yeah, absolutely. The same way it's really important to come up with a definition of replicability and how is it different than reproducibility.
So with respect to transparency, one angle could be, right, that at least make the architecture of the system plus the math that is being used in each of the parts public, right? You still may not know what the trained model does, right? But at the very least, you might be able to say something about what kind of behavior that kind of system can do, right? The problem is OpenAI stopped doing that, right?
Right. Yeah, in fact, this is why, Jan LeCun, you showed him in your video, he is an advocate for having open models, right? But open models are not quite transparent.
It's not OpenAI.
Right. But they're not quite transparent because you don't know what the model actually, why did the model say the risk of Tina is 8 and the risk of you is 2, and so you get the loan and I don't.
Take a look at science and how over the last few thousand years, last 500 years in particular, last 300 years, we've developed and tested all these wonderful thinking tools, techniques, logic and mathematics and statistics and double-blind experiments and lots of methods of thinking that we now know how to trust and when to trust. Now, the systems that are the chat box systems, they don't have any of that. They are not, their input-output rules are not disciplined by all of that information. So they're like fake scientists, on a television show or something, talking impressive, jargon-filled idiocy about what the grounds are for the theories that they're proposing or the explanations they're proposing. If we think of the discipline, and that's not only self-discipline, but mutual discipline within fields, and how we have learned Not perfectly, but how to police the replication crisis, things like this. We're not helpless. We do have tools that we can use to evaluate and criticize and refute and rebut and discredit and destroy the credibility of systems that don't have those systems built into them. And we should not be shy about doing it.
Yeah, I think that gets to the point of like, what is an explanation and what is a good explanation, right? Suppose he builds a tool that is able to explain why a large language model does one thing, and then I build a tool. How do you distinguish between them, right? When I ask my philosopher husband what's an explanation, he says it's an answer to a why question. But that's very abstract, right? If you ask Judea Pearl, who's all about causation, he's like, no, it has to have a causal mechanism. You have to actually know that this caused that, that caused that, that caused that. And so what is a good explanation? Something for you guys to think about. And then just one thing about the large language model, that's a lot of money. You need a lot of money to build a large language model. I just wanted to clarify that. Like, you don't need that much money to do a facial recognition system. But for a large language model, you need a lot of money, like millions of dollars. That's why the Stanford people were crying in their soup that they don't have as much, resources as Google.
Yeah. So one last question before we go to questions from the audience. What message do you guys have to people like me, like young people of the following generation who are going to go into maybe AI or ethics or philosophy and engage with these sorts of questions and have to make those decisions, make those definitions? How do you think we should approach that? What message do you have maybe to inspire us and in equal measure make us a little bit scared, as we ought to be probably?
We haven't scared you already? Like, I'm shaking my boots.
Yeah. You could think about people like Dr. Fauci and think, maybe we should have a whole core of Dr. Fauci type people in this field who are public spirited servants and who are devoting their life to trying to make the world safer and protect us from this, I use the word advisedly, pandemic of dangerous AIs that are coming down the pike at us.
Yeah, I think it's really important to understand the technology. And by understand, I mean really understand the math, understand the trade-offs, understand what the potential is, right? You hear AI everywhere, right? People talk about it and most of them don't know what it is and how it works. That's what you guys should do, right? Learn the math in great detail, understand exactly what that system can and cannot do, right? Then you take that knowledge, right, and you apply it. For example, you will not use certain algorithms because there's a potential that these algorithms may make funky associations, right? You may not use that particular inference mechanism because it can lead to incorrect inferences, right? But that's it. One thing that I've noticed going to AI conferences over the last 5-6 years is a trend that I find potentially really troubling. Not actually potentially, it's actually troubling. People who go to those conferences, usually grad students and faculty, don't know logic anymore. They don't know the foundations of AI. They don't know math, only their math, which is a very small sliver, right, of what you need for these deep neural nets. So learn the other math to understand the trade-offs, right? That's what I would do. And what's frustrating about it is because there's a shift and there's a dynamic in the scientific community, right? If you want to get published, well, you have to do that too, right? But, and there's a viral argument here, if you have the better argument for why that's not good enough, right? Because you also understand the other math and you can show it, the pendulum will swing in the other direction.
Yeah, I completely agree with that. Like the natural language processing people, because the large language models falls under natural language processing, which is a subfield of artificial intelligence. They don't know parse trees. They just don't know. It's like, wait, what? Like, it just boggles the mind. So definitely educate yourself with what's happening. That will help you get over the hype. And then the other message is that these tools are being used in life-altering situations. They're being used in policing, they're being used in our criminal justice system, they're being used in healthcare, in school assignments, so on and so forth, right? Now, would you want a tool to be used on you, your family, your community? When I ask this question in AI and machine learning conferences, nobody raises their hand. Not even the person who's a white male who is in a high socioeconomic status in this country. And the reason I'm saying white male, because obviously right now in America, if you're a white male, you're on top of the totem pole, right? It is what it is, right? Nobody raises their hand. So think about that. The people who know the math, are building the tools, don't want it to be used on them. And that's one of the biggest dangers we have. There's this us versus them. When I teach my students at Northeastern University, it's like, oh, them people. The tools will be used on them people. Them people? Aren't you part of this society? There's this veil of ignorance that, look, we just generated and then whatever, right? And so know the math, get over the hype, and be more like Fauci, right? Care about it, because it is going to be used on you. If you're here and you need an H-1B visa, and you're helping Meta, Facebook, blah, 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 with their misinformation tools, it will come back and affect you, even if you don't want to look at it. So if you're a technologist here, you're a STEM person, these tools will be used on you. Good luck.
Looks like we need some more mathematician Dr. Fauci's then. So let's move on to panelists, our audience questions now. I'll switch over another mic. So who has the most questions here?
There was that hand.
The hand in the back was first, yep. Yeah, it's coming right up.
Thank you so much. Thank you, first of all, for this. It's been really very great and very useful. My name is Laura. I'm an AI ethicist and a research scientist at Northeastern, and I'm a philosopher. First of all, yes, learn the math, but also please learn the philosophy, because it is not like you need to learn the math and the philosophy. You can just, think your way through. That was just a short comment. Then I have one more comment for you. I agree that it is honestly shit that sometimes legislation is suspended for different reasons. The same happens with other types of legislation. There are confidentiality, for example, we limit that in some situations. Does that mean that confidentiality has no teeth? I'm not sure. I think we still need a little more argument to support that. But most of all, I just wanted to say this. I agree that we should have critical learning or critical thinking. I agree we should have all these things. But what can we do, and what can these people who are, maybe go and, do into the same field do? I think one thing, in philosophy, we can take epistemology out of this idea that epistemology is about the ideal knowledge situation. We need to make epistemology into applied epistemology, and we need to make AI ethics into something that is not a calculus of what will this one technology do, and understand that the epistemic implications of these technologies have ethical consequences. So that is where we need to expand that field immensely. If anyone wants to help me do that, I am so up for it. That's all I want to say. Thank you.
Yeah, I agree with you. I think that's a really good point. Yes, absolutely. I had a philosophy PhD as a postdoc who is now a tenure track professor at Georgetown, Will Fleischer. I learned a lot from him when we were talking about fair equality of opportunity. When does it apply, when does it not? And actually along those lines, having talked with a lot of ethicists, including Remo Basu, I would like to be able to call an Uber driver who's a utilitarian. I really don't want a deontologist as an Uber driver. Maybe they can do that, right? The same way you say, I want it quiet, I want the temperature at this level, maybe I could also put in that kind of norms you were talking about. I want a utilitarian Uber driver.
So I can say something to that as well. So thanks for that comment. I think it's really important to, from the beginning, reflect on the technology as well and the algorithms, right? Especially when it gets to ethical questions in light of ethical theories. So at Tufts, we actually have a class that we started 6 years ago now that's called Ethics of AI, Robotics and Human-Robot Interaction. It's a mandatory course for the Human-Robot Interaction program, and it has exactly that goal that you talked about, right? To bring together these different ideas. I think it's important. I think as in general, as somebody who has a PhD in philosophy and in computer science, I think those two actually should go together. We cannot make students mandatory, we cannot make that mandatory, but we're trying. And I think the philosophical reflection always has to really accompany the technological development. That's when technology will be at its best.
Yeah, and I think that's also where the legality versus morality comes into play. I taught a class at Northeastern. I developed it and taught it twice, called Algorithms That Affect Lives, for first-year students, so 18 years old. In math, I explained to them how these algorithms work and how it affects them, their community, and society. Right now, there's no law that says, I can detect whether you're going manic if you're bipolar. And there's no law that says, I cannot show you ads that will harm you, your family, etc. Let's go to Vegas and just blow out our savings, right? There's no law that, and inevitably, there's an 18-year-old who's found Ayn Rand and is an objectivist. It's like, it's not illegal, we should be able to do it. But then there's another 18-year-old who says, I don't want to live in that kind of society where you prey on somebody like that. And these are the kinds of discussions that we should have, and that's where, and we need to get them young, right, when they are 18, about these issues of legality and morality, etc. The problem with that kind of class, I would like it to have it be mandatory for all undergraduates at Northeastern. The problem is scale. In a class like that, you really need 20 students. More than 20 students, it doesn't go that well. So you need a lot of teachers to run it.
Let's get one more question here. You in the back there.
Yeah, I just want to say thank you, to all the panelists for coming. So I think the most telling or touching thing in my personal life that AI has to do with is particularly right now what's going on in the Middle East. So I don't know, I keep finding myself wanting to find a high bar of reliability in the evidence I use, in looking on the internet, and I keep finding that I'm not able to do that. Skepticism just keeps creeping up. So I guess my question is, as our relationship to what we read online changes, what are the chances that it furthers fragmentation and division, where we keep getting different information, have different truths? And is there any hope for, I guess, our collective evaluation of knowledge on the internet allowing us to be more compassionate of different views? I don't know, if any of you guys have anything to say about that.
Well, I can, when you read a scientific paper, right? There's lots of them out there on the internet now because everybody puts papers up on archive. What's usually the criterion for you to take it seriously? You go look where it was published, where it was represented, right? Where the source was. Because the source matters, right? Where it came from. And so sometimes you have to do the research and have to figure out, where that news bit came from. Where did it originate? What was the source? May not be obvious, right? But I think that's still the best method of finding it out. And it's clear that this information, you've worked in this, will get worse, especially with AI bots being targeted at individuals. There's no doubt that's all happening. But the onus is on you to do that work and not just take everything that you see at face value.
Yeah, basically look at the news sources you trust and vary them, right? If you think New York Times is liberal or whatever, The Economist is right. I look at a whole bunch of sources that I trust. And then I make up my own mind, right? If I read something in New York Times that doesn't seem right to me, I do research on it myself to try to figure it out. Hence the critical thinking skills are extremely important.
The question right there.
Thank you very much. It was a very nice discussion. I'm also a researcher in AI, and I'm mainly working with bioinformatics. So Professor Dennett's analogies with biology really is close to my heart, and it made me think. So in the context of language, first of all, when we think about like counterfeit and real, like two opposite sides of the spectrum, there's also like a gray area in the middle where, you know, you can already provide a text with information, correct information, and have the OpenAI or, you know, any other LLM rewrite the text, or have the text written by the LLM, and you go over the text, edit it, so make a strange hybrid in between. So it's not entirely created by the machine, nor like not entirely counterfeit, nor entirely written by a human. So it's a strange hybrid, and it makes me think about the analogy you made regarding the viruses. We know that the human genome contains ancient viral genes, almost like 8%. Do you think there's a future that, you know, there will be like this strange hybrid knowledge that is not entirely counterfeit nor human, but like something in between? And how can we, you know, proceed with that? Thank you.
We all know the fable of the city mouse and the country mouse. And the country mouse is naive and vulnerable in the city, and the city mouse is naive and vulnerable in the country. So that goes back, I get it, to Aesop, I think. And we're going to have to develop immune systems for being a new kind of city mouse. And we're just going to have to become more savvy about what the risks are. That doesn't mean, I think, that we're going to become expert unmaskers. If we all did that, we would be extremely unpleasant people. Nobody would like us. You call your best friend and you get asked these gotcha questions because your best friend is trying to figure out whether you're a bot or a friend. So, but I think we have to, as we've done for millennia, we're going to have to raise our children to be street smart in this new digital world. And that's a tall order, but we can do it if we put shoulder to wheel and reverse some of the norms or some of the values, some of the prizes that have been awarded for fooling people. I think poor Turing, what an honest and much beleaguered man. In the imitation game, he didn't think that putting the emphasis on deception, as he did, would be a bad thing, but it is, because of Goodhart's law. When a symptom becomes a measure, it ceases to be a good symptom. And so now we have all these people out there trying to fool people about the systems they're interacting with. And we should just recognize that and learn to deal with it, and it'll be a multi-dimensional task to turn that around. And since Turing is one of my all-time heroes, I hope we can turn it around and not just blame him for sending us all on this hoax trail that we're now on.
Well said. I see a question right there.
Thank you. Hello, thank you very much for the talk. I have some notes here. It's not ChatGPT asking, it's me. I just want to refer to them. I have a couple questions, one for Professor Eliassi-Rad and one for Professor Dennett. Professor Scheutz, I'll leave my questions for the lab. Professor Eliassi-Rad, you started kind of this discussion talking about how the study that you did on NeurIPS papers, and I'm a grad student. I work in machine learning. I've written an ethics statement like what you described, and I'm sure I'll write more of them. I guess my question to you is, but at the same time, through the discussion, it kind of emerged or came up in the discussion that this problem is not one that can be addressed by individual researchers writing individual papers. It's more of a macro problem. It's a legislation. It's those kinds of solutions. So if we just narrow it down to, in my next research paper, what should I write in that ethics statement, or what should my stance be in general? And for the interest of time, I'll ask the second question. Professor Dennett, you kind of returned to this point just now, and so I want to ask you if the foundation of AI and thinking about AI has been deception from the very beginning with imitation game, but even to this day with generative AI, it's really trained on mimicking humans. If that is not the paradigm for AI moving forward, what should be? What is a different way to try to build AI systems not based on deception? Could human assistance be one of those?
Yeah, so I'll answer your first question. So the thing to do, and this was mentioned already, and Latanya Sweeney also talks about this, is that when you are thinking about the problem and its solution, from that point, at point T0, you should think about the ethical aspects, the societal impact of that work. If you wait until you have already done everything in all your experiments, and now you're like, oh, now I've got to write this societal impact statement, then it's really ethics washing. Because at that point, you already want to sell your tool, right? This is unfortunately what machine learning has now become. It's basically engineering and bad engineering, right? Because when you build a bridge, you build it and you have specifications for it, right? Like this truck is this heavy, can't go over it. This truck, this is this tall, can't go under it, right? Soro drive, etc., right? And so, but we don't do that, right? Because it's all about marketing. There's a fixed size toolbox, and you want to get your tool in, so another tool has to get out, right? And so, one thing is just being honest about the technical limitations of it. In fact, with BinU, we've been talking about how we should have mandatory technical limitations sections in NeurIPS and ICML papers. Now, of course, you may say, if I put in the technical limitations, already it's going to get rejected, right? Because the game is off with your head. I want to be king. My tool should remain in this tool. So there's some of that needs to be changed. But for you as a researcher, start thinking about the societal and ethical aspect of what you are doing up front. So ask the questions up front. Ask about how can I build in some normative values into it? What would it mean anyways, right? So that would be one way to go about it. I'll turn it over to Professor Dennett.
For once, I have a short answer. My motto is we want smart machines, not artificial colleagues. We do not want to make them autonomous. We do not want to give them agendas. We want them, I'm borrowing a word that bravely has been used by Joanna Bryson, a good friend of mine who worked with me on the COG project at MIT. She has a paper called Robots Should Be Slaves. And she's right. Make sure we don't make them so that they have moral rights, so that they can feel pain, so that they can suffer. Then we can take them apart, we can throw them away, we can, whenever we want to. They're just machines. There is such a thing as making them smart, but keeping them as far away from personhood as we can. Then you can't make a promise to them, and they can't make a promise to you.
I think for the interest of time, maybe we'll do one more question.
Okay. I'm Sigrun Svagsdottir in the philosophy department. I have a question for Matthias. I'm not sure I can pronounce your last name, Scheutz. So if I understood you correctly, you were saying that we face different sort of ethical issues when it comes to AI, because it's no longer just how do we use these machines, but how do we build these machines to take certain decision in light of certain ethical principles. And that scares me. Well, first of all, I'm not sure you get out of the use, because as I that is just a question of how to use them, because you said that you were, if I understood you correctly, that you were sort of creating the possibility for others to program them with one moral principle or another, guided by one moral principle or another. And I assume which moral principle they will sort of plug into the machine will depend on what kind of use they want to put them to. So, you know, you come sort of back to it, it's what kind of use we make of them. It will depend, someone will have to decide which principle to sort of plug in. But then secondly, I'm really worried about this because I don't think we have much of an understanding of moral psychology of humans and what makes us good decision makers. And if it's, you know, moral decision makers, my guess would be that it probably requires rather complicated psychology, where we might work with some principle and thinking things through, but then there's just no way I will do that. That's unthinkable. So you just have these checks, you know, maybe based in our affective system or whatever, I don't know. I think we're just at a very speculative stage. So I'm worried that if they're really advanced machines that you plug in these principles that philosophers have come with through the ages, we will be running just really scary experiments about how it works if we have that perfect Kantian agent, that perfect utilitarian agent, that guy with, you know, that works with the doctrine of double effect and so on and so forth. And it's sort of scary to think what will come out of those experiments. It might be pretty awful until we understand better what it is to operate with such psychologies.
So I could talk a long time about all the points you raised here, right? Because you raised a lot. One reason why the systems need to have a sense of what's right or wrong, right, when they make decisions is when they are autonomous, when they provide text, right? Like the large language models or the self-driving cars when they are in a morally conflicting situation, they have to make a decision of what to do, right? It could be your elder care robot that, you know, has to decide whether to give you the pain medication you ask it to give you because you cannot get out of bed, or whether it needs to contact the nurse, right, before it actually gives you that. And you can very easily get into morally conflicting situations where multiple principles are at odds, and then the question is what does the system do? If we don't put that reasoning in, you know, it'll come down one way or the other, and very likely it's going to violate our moral and normative expectations. We had a very large project for 6-7 years where we had philosophers and social psychologists, right, and computer scientists and logicians all work on exactly that problem. So we have a good understanding, I think, of what people do, but note that the moral reasoning that people do, right, is not necessarily the moral reasoning that you want the machine to do. So here's an example. At MIT, they had a project where they gave people vignettes online about morally conflicting situations with cars, right? Autonomous cars. So you have a person in front of the car cannot brake. Do you run that person over or do you park the car in the wall next door, right? Well, whether people think the car should run that person over or not will depend on whether they view themselves as being in the car or outside. When they're in the car, they want the car to kill the pedestrian, right? When they're outside, they have a more utilitarian perspective. And then the trade-off is how many lives can you save based on your action, right? Obviously, those two are not consistent, right? So it's very important to understand, I think, human moral reasoning for machines that interact with people, right? But we can even, in robots, just start with the law, right? Make sure that the system understands what's legal and what's not legal. And that already is problematic, right? Because the law it depends on interpretation, right? Oftentimes it's not entirely clear how to apply it and what applies. So the short answer is this increasing evidence that when you don't put ethics into the system, it will do stupid things and will cause people harm. The question is how to do it. There's a camp in AI that is doing it based on just machine learning, observing human behavior. As a result, when you just observe human behavior, if the human is not morally upstanding all the time, the system will learn these transgressions. There's a different approach that's based on deontic logic. It's a reasoning-based approach, right? It's different sort of inference mechanisms based on general principles that you have. These principles could be about rights. The principles could be about duties, right? And then you reason through it. At the end of the day, the judgment's out, which is the better way of going for it, right? But I think the machine learning view that's just based on observations alone is very problematic, even though that is right now sort of the more dominant view in AI of how to do it. But almost everyone is in agreement that something needs to go into the machine, right? For the machine to be aligned with the norms and values that we have.
Yeah, still I'm worried that, I mean, the question isn't like what humans would do, as you, I think, noted, but what are the good decision makers that we have a sense that the decent people, how do they tend to steer them ways?
Yeah, and in fact, sometimes the bar is higher for machines, right? What I give my students usually the example of supererogation is a term that philosophers use for being more morally upstanding than you need to be, right?
I know.
And the point is, if you see the kid on the railroad tracks, right, or the T, right, fell off, is in front of a rapidly approaching train, are you morally obligated to save the kid? Well, if the risk is very high that you will die, you're not morally obligated, right? The robot is. The robot should jump and try, even if it has a very high likelihood that, you know, nothing will happen, it'll get destroyed. So how do you get that into the system, right? How do we make that happen? Still not clear, right? There's different approaches, but that we want it, I think that is clear.
Yeah, but what exactly we want, what the right sort of normative view is, and how then to install that. That's the question. Thank you.
Anyway, thank you. I think that concludes our panel event, and thank you again for coming. Let's give a round of applause for our panelists.